We are live with two people. There we go. Hi, Marcia. It's good when you can see the people come in at the very beginning and you say hello to people. So, hi, Sarah. So, Elon, it is exciting to do yet another one of these at an irregular hour. Uh, not our usual Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern time that we've gotten people accustomed to.
I think the Jewish holidays are really messing with our schedule. It's going to be the same week next week too, right? I mean, so this is the time of year nobody's used to anything. If you're Jewish, nobody's used to anything normal. Like second half of September, early October, everything's a little off. So it's like
I
totally.
haven't done the math, but it seems like the odds of both Wednesdays in a row being on a Hag are
Yeah.
are very low. I mean, it best 1 in 7, I would think, but it seems worse than that because we got the end of the second day and we got the lead into Kol Nidre, right? That's our the 4 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday.
Yeah.
So
I'd argue maybe it's 2 and 7 because if you're doing, you don't really do the day before either. So,
yeah.
it's the nature of Jewish holidays.
Yeah.
It's the whole
The
like,
nature of October. Well, anyhow,
yeah.
we're really glad that folks have joined us. The reason that we are together today at this hour is it's the culmination of UN General Assembly week in New York. And today we had Bibi Netanyahu speaking. Earlier in the week, of course, Donald Trump. We had a conference of states around the two-state solution on Monday that was chaired by President Macron. We had meetings with the President of the United States and Arab and Muslim leaders on Tuesday. Abbas spoke in front of the GA, but by video on Wednesday. And next week is Bibi's visit to the White House. So it's a very busy week in the midst of the days of awe and the days of reckoning. And perhaps there's no better time. I've written a little bit about the need for reckoning in all of this time. But we are here today, gathered for Substack Live with Elon and I to review the bidding of the week and sort of go over what has transpired in New York in front of the great green marble slate wall there, and what are the images? I know one of the enduring images for Bibi Netanyahu is this little cartoon of the bomb that relates to Iran. So he's always got some visuals. Tell us a little bit, Elon, about what we heard this morning from Prime Minister Netanyahu, and tell us a little bit about the props and the visuals he was using this time.
Well, look, not surprised at all in terms of what we heard being the same old usual thing when he tends to show up and do these speeches. He's talking first, second, and third to the Israeli public and to like his right wing base. I mean, clearly nobody in the room, very few in the room at the United Nations.
Practically empty, really.
Yeah. And that's actually that when it comes to like props, the first two things to say about the speech are one, just how many people walked out, which was a thing last year too, but really this year. And two is the prop he used this year. He's always got some kind of gimmick. This year was, I'm going to ask people in Gaza to listen, and I'm going to put loudspeakers all over Gaza so people can hear my speech, which, at least according to Israeli press reporting, there was strong objections from the IDF for, because you're putting troops at risk for this kind of gimmick. That's not just that, it's also just like offensive. If you're like Israel and you're trying to portray a world in which, you are not the occupier, putting microphones and blasting them into Gaza around like 2 million people who fundamentally disagree with you from the prime minister of Israel, like just seems, like kind of like one of those definitions of occupation feel to me. When he actually did it in the speech, he used it as an opportunity to talk to the hostages and say, I hope the hostages hear this. But the reality is, like, the hostage families are all just fundamentally opposed to everything he's saying and doing. And so it just felt so much more like a prop than any kind of a real meaningful move. So maybe we start there. Like the visuals, not all that different than usual. Jeremy, I don't know. What was your take on his speech?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I gave the quote afterwards that I said that this empty room is really the metaphor, the isolation that Bibi Netanyahu has driven Israel into is just such a tragedy. And it comes on the heels of a week in which you had basically the entire world saying that it wants this conflict to end, and it wants to recognize the state of Palestine. It wants there to be a state of Israel. The world is willing to chip in, right, to like help with security, to help with investment, to help make the Palestinian state a success. And they've got their arm extended to Israel to accept it into the region, to normalize relations all over the world. And this is the response. I mean, the speech was, very, if you've watched his speeches over the years, which I'm sure you have, and many of our viewers, I imagine, have as well, there's a very traditional through line. It all begins and ends with Iran, and it is all couched in a um, epic battle of civilizations. It's a battle of good versus evil. Israel is fighting the fight on behalf of all of these weak Western democracies that are unwilling to be, on the front lines and to take on evil. And this is who we are. We are fighting for you, and we are fighting against evil. And this is falling on deaf ears. What is happening in Gaza itself is viewed by the world as evil. And the concept that he used, that Israel wants to be a light unto the nations, I mean, it is precisely for those of us who believe in Jewish morality and Jewish ethics and what the Jewish people's state should be. It's precisely because of our morals that this war has to end. And what is being done is so counter to it. And he had not one word in the entire speech of empathy for the people of Gaza. A lot of defensiveness about Israel providing aid and Israel doing more than any other country ever would. And I'll just say this is BS, and the whole world knows it. And it just makes Israel, unfortunately, I think, more isolated and weaker for the long run.
So, and Jeremy, I want to actually pick up on one point you made, because actually I saw a comment saying, they have no idea what Jeremy is talking about with the world saying there's an open arms, like the world is offering open arms to Israel. So let me explain that to folks, because I actually think this whole week had this theme of like open arms and a pathway out, which is, what you see the world doing is the focus is all on Palestinian statehood recognition, but nobody really understands. Like, there's a much broader context to what the world did this week. And I think what you saw was real unity around a plan for post-conflict Gaza, where the Arab states are standing up and saying, we are willing to consider even putting troops in, countries like Indonesia, but also some of the countries talking to Donald Trump. In the meeting he held earlier in the week, you have, the Arab states saying we are willing to help support a aftermath and a governing structure in Gaza. We're willing to help with rebuilding and humanitarian assistance. We're willing to support a plan that includes no Hamas in Gaza and Hamas disarmed. We are offering all this. The condition for this is we need to see real progress towards Palestinian statehood. And that's where the statehood recognition piece came in. In many ways, it was a down payment from countries like France, from the UK, to Arab partners, to others, to the 142 countries who are now signed up for this post-conflict plan, which, interestingly enough, we'll talk more about, is not all that different than what Donald Trump is laying out on the table now and his team, and not all that different than a lot of the ideas we were laying out during the Biden administration. And so there's one pathway that takes you towards that world, the world where Hamas is no longer in Gaza, a world where the hostages come home, a world where the war ends. Then there's the entire separate pathway, which Netanyahu continues to push for, which is endless conflict, endless war, no strategy for the aftermath other than maybe let's try to push all the Palestinians out of Gaza. And when this offer is made from the entire world, his response to that this week, and they made it throughout the week in a series of events we'll talk about, his response to that offer is no. And more than no, one thing I thought was really striking in his remarks was the transition to specifically Palestinian statehood came after a list of anti-Semitic attacks on Israelis and on Jews throughout the world. He based the last of which was the attack on two Israeli embassy workers here in Washington just a couple of months ago, or a few months ago now, at a Jewish AJC event. And he ties that directly to recognition, saying anti-Semitism and recognition are one and the same. No. Like, recognition is what we're giving the Arabs in exchange for all these things that they're willing to offer you for a better pathway forward. And instead, you just turned it all into France, the UK, Portugal, other countries, some of them longtime supporters of Israel. You're all anti Semitic because you don't support Bibi Netanyahu's agenda. I thought that was really problematic to
Yeah, I
see.
just want to highlight, the specific offer that is on the table is something called the New York Declaration. And I really urge people to Google that, look it up, read it, understand what is specifically being said. And there is a lack of knowledge about the existence of this. There is a lack of sort of spreading the information. So for everybody who's watching this, make it your personal mission to actually download this New York Declaration and send it to 10 of your family and friends with whom you've been discussing whether or not there is actually a partner for peace. And the answer to that is that the entire world at this point is ready to be that partner for peace. I mean, we're sort of rewinding our way through the week, Elon. We started with Bibi's speech this morning, and we talked a little bit about the Monday two-state meeting. But I also want to just highlight that Mahmoud Abbas spoke on Wednesday, and he was very clear. I don't know if you want to run through some of the points that he laid out, but the president of the Palestinian Authority took this opportunity to make some really important points.
Yeah, and I will always say, like, every speech from Abbas, from Abu Mazen, we sometimes get, like, cranky Abu Mazen, or we get positive Abu Mazen, is kind of how I'd like to jokingly refer to it as. And I think we got the good Abu Mazen this week for sure at the UN. He was out there very strongly against Hamas, very clearly saying the PA wants to take responsibility for Gaza, very strongly saying Hamas must disarm, they're ready to work together, the Palestinian Authority, with the international community on a plan for post conflict Gaza. He also talked about reform. Now, we always have to take this with a grain of salt. What he said was elections a year after the war ends, which is a commitment that he's made to the French and to the Brits and to others who have recognized. And we've also had real progress on the Palestinian prisoner payment issue. He didn't mention that in his speech, but I know that basically at this point, we're just in the final processes of verifying, at least European and EU countries are in the final processes of verifying that the system, what the so-called pay-for-slave system, which is what I think opponents of it call it in the most extreme way, Palestinians call it kind of a prisoner martyr system, payment system, has really been reformed and changed, something that was a long time effort during the Biden administration, you know, began to be implemented early in the Trump administration. So you've got real, I think, meaningful signaling from him. He has to follow through on that. There's a long history of the PA not following through. There's also a long history of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu undermining the PA at every single opportunity. But again, the Israeli
Speaking of
answer.
which, by the way, of course, the United States denied the visa for
Mhm.
President Abbas to actually come and for the whole PLO delegation to be in New York. The rest of the world, all the bad actors all over the world, everybody was welcome in New York. The only actor not allowed in was Mahmoud Abbas.
Yeah, it's true. The Iranians are here, loud and proud. It's boggles my mind. And this was again an opportunity to actually strengthen Abbas in front of his own people by essentially having the him stand with the French and the British and the Saudis and everybody else in this offer that's being made to Israel, and strengthen him as the statehood thing happens. And the statehood thing, just to be clear, really is important because it actually is very popular amongst Palestinians. Still, it empowers him if you do it right. And instead, the Trump administration takes that opportunity away from him and then turns around and blames the Palestinian Authority, and just jumps in bed with Netanyahu again and again and again. So, uh, pretty frustrating from that perspective.
So let's shift gears. So we've talked a little bit about Bibi, we've talked about Abbas, we've talked about Macron and the Monday conference. The one we haven't talked about yet is the president of the United States. And I think that Trump's role in all of this is probably the most essential role of all the actors on the stage. So Tuesday, he starts his way up another escalator. Escalators and Trump, to me, it's just it's triggering to talk about escalators and Trump. I won't go there. But Trump, steps on the escalator, which immediately stops, and that triggers a whole international controversy. He gets in front of the teleprompter. It stops, triggering yet another controversy. But at the end of the day, he did give a speech. Tell us a little bit about the speech, and then I also want to talk a bit about his subsequent meeting with Muslim and Arab leaders.
Yeah, I mean, the speech itself was, I'll be honest, I could not watch the hour-long speech. I was like, well, I guess if we're going to talk about it on the Substack, I have to watch the entire thing, and I couldn't. I had to watch the revised, drawn down version, partially because he talked for 3 times as long as a leader is supposed to talk to. Is it a
Right.
lot
The
of
only
time?
person who talked longer, by the way, was Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu talked longer than Trump.
And both these guys, this is what happens with authoritarians. They tend to like bust through their time limits because nobody tells them no. I
Right.
mean, the
There's no
guy I
rules. The
remember,
only rules they set. Yeah.
exactly. The classic I remember is like Muammar Gaddafi talking for 2.5 hours at the UN, and there's an awesome picture of the Libyan like representative standing like above him, just horrified. And it felt kind of like the same way. But Trump just did what Trump does. I think it was very unilateralist, which is really the approach he comes from. The United States is different than Israel, right? The United States is a global superpower, right? So when Donald Trump comes in here and does that, people take him seriously. I think they have to. They have their own interests at stake, and these countries know American military might, American economic might. This is why half the room doesn't walk out on Donald Trump, even if they're kind of horrified and disgusted. It does lead them, I think, to look for other options like the Chinese, the Russians, others. At the same time, they play along because they have to. And you just heard, I don't think you heard anything very new from him, just really going after the United Nations as he always does. On Israel, Palestine, he really just echoed the Netanyahu talking point that somehow recognition is a gift to Hamas. Again, it's not. It becomes more of a gift to Hamas when you refuse to let President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority take credit for it by actually having them be there. um, and so I didn't think there was anything that noteworthy or shocking from Trump's speech, other than the
But
fact that the
then
next 3 years. Then,
But
yeah,
then the important thing was really the meeting
yeah,
that he had with the leaders of, I think, seven significant Arab and Muslim countries, including Indonesia, Turkey. And at that meeting, a apparently we've only seen press reports from Politico and Axios about the meeting, but apparently Steve Witkoff did outline a 21-point plan, a serious post-war plan, a serious plan for getting out of this mess. And the reporting of this, as I've seen, the headline points, I don't know if you want to run through some of them, but it sounded an awful lot to me like the basic points that a lot of us have been making for nearly 2 years about what is actually needed. And nothing that I read that I would necessarily disagree with. So I'm curious your take and if you want to run through some of those points.
sure, yeah, and it really, like, to be clear, it's also very similar to a lot of the ideas we were pushing, really, like, starting in October and November of 23 for how this ends, and also very consistent again with the New York Declaration and what
Right.
all these other countries are saying, right? They're all talking about the same things. They're talking about an end of the war. They're talking about getting all the hostages out. They're talking about getting aid into Gaza. They're talking about a post-conflict plan that involves some interim authority led by Palestinians with international support. That
It
has a
doesn't
role, but it
include Hamas. I mean, very
does
importantly,
not include Hamas.
for those in the chat who've been saying, what about Hamas? This wouldn't include Hamas. That's very clear in everybody's declaration, whether it's the New York Declaration or Trump's plan or what the Arab leaders are saying.
Yeah, and there's a demilitarization component to this
Right.
where Hamas gives up weapons, right? Now, and so, there are some kooky things in it, like reports I've seen that Tony Blair is going to be the governor of Gaza. I think that's a terrible idea for a lot of different reasons.
I think British colonialism really worked out well. So, I think just bringing that back in the 21st century sounds like a really top-notch idea.
Yeah. Now, look, here's the thing. The $1 million question, this is the one I get asked, and I saw it in the chat again. Like, how does Hamas agree to this? And like, what does it actually look like in reality? Hamas agrees to ending the war. Hamas agrees to giving up governance, right? Which is what they've already agreed to because they don't really want to own governance in Gaza and they realize that's what they need to do to end the war. Maybe they also agree to have some of their leaders exiled and shipped off to some other country or people take them like Turkey. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Hamas is not just going, I would think we need to be realistic, right? Everybody's got a demilitarization plan, a plan where Hamas's like weapons are ultimately are given up. I don't think that is going to realistically happen on day one. No. Hamas is going to try. They are going to try to do what Hezbollah did in Lebanon, which worked quite effectively for a while for Hezbollah. And that's similar to any counterinsurgency, whether it's Iraq and like the competition in Iraq, where you had all these different and still have all these different non-government militias, and what happens in a scenario like that is you create alternative institutions of government and security. Those alternative institutions, if they are more effective in providing security to the population, political representation to the population, services to the population, if the population is angry enough with Hamas, over time, those institutions become increasingly the state and Hamas becomes increasingly weaker and smaller and loses its legitimacy. That's how you're going to have to play this. And the difference between Lebanon and Gaza is it was really hard to do this in Lebanon to stop Hezbollah because there was just an arms being flown in from Iran to Damascus and pushed into Lebanon, basically willy-nilly with no way for Israel to really stop that. This is different. The international community can set up real measures around Gaza's borders to prevent large flow of weapons into Gaza. Israel controls those borders. Egypt controls those borders. You really can. You'd have to win this play.
And you're introducing third-party troops. I mean, that's, I think, a really key part of this is that this isn't just a, force of bureaucrats going in under Governor Tony Blair to run the place. This is also a security force that has Palestinians trained by, most likely, an American three-star general, which is how we've trained the Palestinian security forces on the West Bank that work so closely with the IDF. Again, really important for those who are cynical and negative and doubting. It's important to remember that trained Palestinian security forces work day in and day out today with the IDF on the West Bank. And that same process of training would be in place for a new Palestinian security force to go into Gaza, backed up by troops from Arab countries, possibly, as you mentioned earlier. There's talk even of a country like Indonesia putting in some forces quietly and off the record. I think you and I have both heard that some European countries might include some officers in all of this in order to have a European presence on the ground. But this is not going to be easy work, and it's not day one work. It is a process over days, weeks, months, and years of gradually taking and holding territory and clearing out Hamas strongholds, clearing out the tunnels, clearing out their network, clearing out their command and control centers. There's a lot of work to be done on the security front, but you've got to have the governance and you have to have redevelopment going on at the same time.
Right. And look, we've actually, like, for people who say this is impossible to do, we did it pretty successfully, actually, with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, where you really have marginalized them. Are they gone? No, but they're really weakened and really different. And part of that came with not just bombing them, it's with everything that comes afterwards that actually replaces them, which is really the idea. Now, in terms of cynicism, I think, Jeremy, you and I had slightly different reactions to this. I'm still pretty cynical about the Trump plan, and I will remain that way until I actually see him willing to execute. Because my concern is Bibi Netanyahu shows up on Monday and says, but here are my 5 concerns. And Trump says, great. Because he always says great, and he always feels like we're in a good place, like we're going to do a diplomatic deal with Iran, or I'm not going to listen to Netanyahu on this because I need to, because the Arab states are telling me something different. And then Netanyahu shows up and just gets everything he wants. And I just really worry we're just going to have the same dynamic, and we're going to come out on Monday. And again, we're just going to have the Trump administration blaming Hamas for everything that's gone wrong. And
I am not disagreeing with you at all. I want to make sure it's very clear. I do not believe anything that comes out of that man's mouth or out of the White House. Yeah. But, it will only be done if it is in his own personal interest, right? If there is a pathway here that enriches him because the Gulf states are, all in on this and they want economic growth and stability, and he's got investments there. He'll do it if it is a pathway to a Nobel Prize. He'll do it if it's a way to enhance his personal stature. That's the only path forward. So I agree with you, but I do think that what Witkoff and Blair and others have begun to put together, it does have the elements of the right path forward. And clearly, when the Arab countries and the Muslim countries got briefed on it and they walked out and they said they could endorse and support it, there were things in there that met the basic bottom lines that they've outlined. And I want to bring into this conversation the president's very clear language, which we haven't discussed yet, about no annexation, right? And that apparently is part of the 21 points. And it is a piece of this discussion. And it came up in that meeting with the Arab and Muslim leaders. And then he was asked about it again the next day on TV. And there is, live video of him reiterating, I think it was in advance of the meeting with Erdogan, did you discuss this with Erdogan? It doesn't matter if I discuss it with him. Israel is not going to annex. Now, again, that could be Wednesday, and by Monday, it's 180 degrees flipped on its head. But he did say it, and he said it pretty clearly. And if there's one person in the world who can actually slam on the brakes on what Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu, and the other extremists of this government want to do, it's Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, it's Donald Trump, right? They're going to listen to him if he says no, and he has said it. Now, again, the meeting comes Monday with Trump and Bibi, and as you said, who knows, right? The latest thing, I mean, we're all in on Ukraine, right? I mean, remember where we were with Zelensky 6 months ago. So there's just absolutely no continuity, no philosophy, no strategy. There's nothing here other than the whims of the moment. So I'm not giving it any credence. But I do think that if Trump wants this to end, if there's one person in the world who has the bully pulpit and the lever to actually make Bibi Netanyahu stop and accept the offer that is on the table, it would be Donald Trump, because Donald Trump can go to the Israeli public where he's got like 75% approval rating, and he can say, it is time for this to end. And by the way, the time for this to end also has 75% agreement in the Israeli public.
Yeah, for sure. And I should say on the annexation piece, we also saw, I think, a positive step, at least in Congress this week as well, as we shift a little bit to what's happening here in the United States, which is this letter supported by Brad Schneider and Jamie Raskin that had 180 members of Congress sign on to it in a span of just a few days, right through the middle of the high holidays. Very similar to a letter that was signed on to a few years ago when annexation was last really in the mix in 2020. I think what's important about this, and positive too, is, let's be honest, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is much more divisive now than it was in 2020 in the aftermath of the war in Gaza. The politics are just much harder. And to still have 180 members of Congress, almost same number that we had last time, maybe just 10 less, still agreeing on this basic principle of opposition to annexation is a really good thing, and sends a pretty strong message to the Israeli leadership that Democrats across the board also think this is a bad idea. They're hearing it from the Saudis, they're hearing it from the Emiratis, they're hearing it from Trump. It's good for them to hear it from Democrats too, even if sometimes Bibi Netanyahu, I think, frankly, cares less. A lot of other Israelis in the U.S. Still really do care about what this notion of bipartisanship on Israel.
So I just want to take a second and say welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining Word on the Street Live. And we are doing a special briefing that follows Bibi Netanyahu's address to the United Nations General Assembly this morning. We're sort of recapping the whole week, very action-packed week, somehow in the middle of the high holidays for the Jewish community, when we normally are a little bit slower. But this is a very action-packed week, starting with two-state solution caucus summit on Monday, chaired by French President Emmanuel Macron, followed by Donald Trump speaking Tuesday, important meetings with Arab and Muslim world leaders, Abbas's speech Wednesday, Trump and Bibi meeting this coming Monday. So this is a very active time on all of our issues. So thank you for joining us for this Word on the Street Live. We are going again next week to not be at our normal time. Wednesday, 4 p.m. Eastern is our normal time for doing these live Word on the Street broadcasts. And you can always find us on Spotify, Apple, other platforms as well to watch and listen post facto. But next week, we will be live at 11 a.m. on Tuesday and we'll be doing a live word on the street with Yehuda Kurtzer, who is the North American director of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And we're going to be doing, I think, a more of a reflective take on the state of where Israel is at in as we're in these high holiday moments of reflection. These are the days of sort of repentance and recounting what has been going on and making new commitments about what we're going to do differently. And I think there is something, Elon, to be said for taking a step back with somebody like Yehuda Kurtzer, who's one of the most thoughtful people. I think you know Yehuda pretty well. I'm really looking forward to that 11 a.m. on Tuesday.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to that too. And I got to say, this was all Jeremy's brilliant idea, or maybe with some of our J Street colleagues, because I was off. I don't know what I was doing. I think I was trying to raise money in the Hamptons or something like that when you all came up with this idea. And then we were just meeting yesterday and you were like, we have Yehuda Kurtzer. And I'm like, wow, that's so convenient. In the middle of the high holidays, he's perfect. It's like, yeah, Jeremy already.
Yes, that was the idea. Not a
Well,
coincidence.
good. Good.
And the other thing I just want to highlight is that the following week is the anniversary of October 7th. And I just want to say that we will definitely be marking the 2 years. It's just shocking that it's been 2 years as J Street, together with our colleagues in the Progressive Israel Network. We've got a couple of very important programs planned. One will zero in on the hostages. We'll actually, I don't want to break any exciting news here, but we are going to have a released hostage and a family member on a Zoominar of some sort with the Progressive Israel Network on October 7th. And we'll also be focusing on the suffering in Gaza with Palestinians and relief workers on the following day. So we've got a lot planned over the next couple of weeks. So back to our discussion about where we're at right now, Elon. The 180 signatures on a letter in the House of Representatives, and there are 215 Democrats now, 214 with Adelita Grijalva's election on Tuesday in the House, and 180 of them signed this letter. There are a lot of discussions about shifts taking place in the Democratic Party on Israel-related issues, and a growing willingness of Democratic Party elected officials to speak out on issues related to Israel's behavior in this war and the nature of our oversight of arms. I'm curious, we're also seeing some reflections from the people that you worked with about the Biden era and the first year of this war. John Feiner and Phil Gordon wrote a really important piece, I would say, this week. Was it in The Atlantic? Am I right? No, they were in Politico. It was in Politico. And for people who didn't see it, they made a call for limits on arms. I wonder if you want to just comment on what John and Phil and some of your colleagues are doing, and maybe even Kamala Harris in her new book, if you want to make a couple of comments about that.
Sure. And look, this is a complicated process for people. I think people have really strong feelings and really hard experiences from their year in government. And it's been interesting to watch the response to Phil and John's piece, which really what it was arguing for was putting in place legislation that would make it impossible for Israel to use American weapons in Gaza. Israel could still have the weapons, just not for use in the in Gaza. But what's challenging is the reaction from all sides to something like that and wrestling with yourself. I think one reaction is like, well, you should have done this when you were in government. Like, why are you writing this now? And I've seen that criticism. Look, I've seen that criticism of me too, and it is totally fair. I can only speak for myself on that when I say that whenever I was in the Biden administration, even though I disagreed with some of the policies, I not only there's this whole argument of like, well, I could do more, make more of a difference on the inside than the outside. Like, yes, that's part of it, but part of it is also these are really hard, challenging issues. Do I believe the people I am working with like are trying to do the best that they can to get the best outcome possible? Which really was like, let's end this war as quickly as possible. And I do believe that is where the administration was, maybe not in the first couple months when the view was, well, like Israel does need to degrade Hamas to a certain degree to ensure that October 7th can never happen again. But really, after that, it really did become more and more people in the administration fighting for, arguing for, and eventually the administration taking on the position of we just need to end this war. And so as long as I felt people were trying to do the best they can and it was intended to get to that outcome, like I was comfortable continuing to serve. even if I disagreed, and some people can disagree with me, and some people can disagree with Phil and John and say, well, you should have just resigned or spoken out. I can say that like people like Phil and John were very actively campaigning for and making the case, frankly, at more senior levels of government than me, right? Like they really were in, like, I would say I was in a lot of the second rooms, but they were like in the first rooms. They were in the room with, the president and the vice president, like almost every day talking about these issues. And I know from experience of working with them that they were oftentimes making the case for a different policy. And the question is, did they make more of a difference there or on the outside? And then, the other thing to just think about as we think, and this is so hard because there is this question about responsibility. There's also a question of if you convince somebody of your position, like we need to build a coalition here, the Democratic Party, J Street, opponents of the war, um, and so when somebody comes around to your position, this is like a challenge with like Jake Sullivan, for example, who's now saying, let's, like I'm okay with putting limitations on arms to Israel. It's complicated. Jake was a national security advisor for Joe Biden, who did not have that policy for a year. And a lot of people feel like, Jake, you should have made that case more forcefully in government. On the other hand, I don't really want to like push aside when a very influential person who a lot of politicians and others look to and still listen to, like says that, like you want to take advantage of that. So it's complicated.
It is complicated, and for me as someone who was on the outside, running an advocacy organization, it's very easy for us to say, starting a year plus ago, the policy needs to change. I mean, it was actually a year and a half ago at this point that we started saying that with the violations of, let's say, the humanitarian aid law that said you can't give arms to somebody who's blocking humanitarian aid. We were already saying back in the spring of 2024 that Israel was violating that law and weapons should be withheld. But that's very easy for an advocacy organization to say. It's much more difficult within the administration making policy to hold that position and stand on principle and ultimately leave if you want to be part of the decision making to make it better. So I understand there's a distinction here, and I do agree with you that when people come around, you should welcome them. When people do change their mind, there isn't some sort of a penalty box that you need to make them sit in for the rest of their lives. We need to build that coalition because our real adversary is Donald Trump, right? Our real adversary is authoritarianism, both in Israel and here. Our real adversary is the forces that are fighting against peace and against justice and against diplomacy and against democracy. And people who were right and people who were wrong, or people who disagreed on Gaza specific policy, can work together. And the only way we're going to beat Donald Trump and MAGA and authoritarianism and preserve democracy is if we're all working on that together. And so I think that's really an important message. Speaking of that, what about Kamala Harris? She did address this in her book. I know you were at her side through a lot of this. Maybe tell people a little bit of what she said in the book about Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have not finished reading everything. I have not finished the book, so I don't know if there's more. I
We know how it ends, though.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. I will say, and so the parts I've read so far about Israel and Gaza, and what's also been in the excerpts, is one. I think her description of her meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, where she clearly was incredibly skeptical of him, um, and did not believe he was going to go for a ceasefire. Two, I do think, and she talks about the speech she gave at Selma that I helped
Right.
work on along with others, where she did lean in further than the administration's position had been at that point on ceasefire and the humanitarian situation. Um, Similarly, she also talks about, I mean, frankly, like the challenge that Joe Biden had in just expressing the same empathy for for Palestinians as he did for Israelis in the aftermath of October 7th, which is also true and a challenge that like many in our administration had, and a challenge that American policymakers sometimes have because they spend all this time with Israelis and a lot less time with
Right.
Palestinians.
That's a huge problem. I'm just going to
Yeah,
interrupt you there
yeah,
and say,
yeah,
this is a real critique of American foreign policy in this issue, has
yep,
been the extent of the engagement in the policy making of people who only know one side of this conflict. and who only have relationships with people on one side, and it's a huge part of the problem.
Yes, 100%. It like totally is. And Joe Biden was very,
Right, he's
emblematic
sort
of
of
that.
the apex of that problem.
Yeah, and so she talks about that. And she doesn't really get into what she would have done differently. Maybe it's there. I mean, I will tell you that like the people who were advising her after October 7th were Phil Gordon, who just came out with that article, was me, who, I went and joined J Street, which tells you a little bit of something about where I am. And I don't know exactly where she would have been if she was actually sitting in the seat. Like, I really don't. And she doesn't go into the here's how I would have done things differently. And I'm not sure in a book that was really about the presidential campaign, if that's the right place to do it. I can tell you her instincts were different than Joe Biden's and had a lot more empathy there for Palestinians than he did. And I think that would have led to, if you ask me, a better policy. But I don't exactly know what that would have been. And certainly she would have
And
had
maybe we
advisors.
need to have Kamala Harris
Yeah.
on Word on the Street Live and have a conversation with her about what her policy would have been and what she thinks American policy should be moving forward. What do you think?
I mean, I'd love to. I'm not going to say that I can produce that necessarily, Jeremy. I did work for her. I'm a fan of hers.
I did press
You know,
Elon on this offline, so I thought I'd just
yeah,
raise.
but like, this is not. I'm not going to pretend to, necessarily, say I have the wussa to make that happen. Although, I mean, certainly I would advise her to do it. I mean, what could be a better
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, um, listen, now we're getting towards the end of our conversation here, and I want to look forward. And obviously, the big thing is the meeting on Monday between the president and the prime minister, and then we're done with the UN week, and we move beyond the holidays. The offensive in Gaza City is going full force. What do you see moving forward? What do you think can come out of Monday? Witkoff says that he's confident this time, confident that they're on the verge of actually coming up with something that'll work.
Yeah, and Trump said that today too. If you saw, like, said we're almost got a deal. I mean, look, if we get it, that'd be great. Unless Donald Trump really comes down incredibly hard on Bibi and says, like, end this. And he might. I'm pretty skeptical that he will. And Trump also, look, the other thing Trump might do and is already saying it publicly is that this is Trump understands public opinion. Trump understands world public opinion. And he sees media. He sees how this is all playing for Israel right now. We didn't talk about the
The
fact that, like,
polls. We didn't talk about the polls.
no, whether it's the polls or, I mean, just the fact that like 6 countries are now saying they won't participate in Eurovision if Israel is in, or consideration of kicking Israel out of the
European
European
soccer.
Soccer Federation. Like, these things are like a big deal. These are the kinds of things that like Trump tracks. He might just tell Netanyahu, "Look, Bibi, like, this is not working for you."
Look at the
But
Quinnipiac poll this week. I mean, the percentage of Americans that thinks we should continue to help Israel is way below 50% now. And 50% of Americans think it is genocide. And I mean, the numbers are just horrific. What this is doing to the U.S. Israel relationship and to Israel's image in not only America, but around the world is horrific. So I think he's got a lot of good arguments to sit in the Oval Office with Bibi and say, it's time for this to stop.
And yet, I think the most likely outcome is that, like, that's not going to happen, and they'll come out and say Bibi's ready to do it, but Hamas isn't, and therefore it must continue. Like, and yeah, I just, until I see otherwise, Jeremy, like, unfortunately, like, that's where I'm at, and I think that's where we're at probably again until we get a different Israeli government, which means another 6 months or a year. That's the most likely outcome here.
Well, I will continue to be the more optimistic of the two of us, the less knowledgeable and the less, having actually been in the room for the experience, which maybe allows me to be a little bit more optimistic and hopeful, and to say that I do really believe that there are a lot of positive incentives aligned here to bring this to an end. And contrary to some of the comments that are flowing through the chat, this is all contingent on, and this is a pathway to defeat Hamas. I mean, let us be really clear. This is about Hamas being removed from the picture. They will not be governing. They will be disarmed. The state that ultimately will be built is demilitarized. It will have nothing to do with Hamas. It will take time to make sure that is happening, a lot of international engagement, but there's a pathway here out of this mess. And I do believe that we, as J Street, can continue to be a force for pushing that in the right direction. So, any final words, Elon?
No, I think that sounds like about it for other than maybe Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova, and Gemar Chatima Tova. I guess we'll have Tuesday to say that.
We'll have
Before,
Tuesday, exactly. So Tuesday,
yeah.
11 a.m. Eastern with Yehuda Kurtzer from the Shalom Hartman Institute, a live word on the street next week. And then we will be back the following week with programming around October 7th. So thank you all very much for joining us on Word on the Street Live, and we will see you next week. Shabbat
About
Shalom.